In last week's story, we left off with David fleeing from King Saul. He's been fleeing from King Saul for an awful long period of time, it seems. But we're now coming up to 1 Samuel chapter 22. And David has escaped to a cave in an area called Adullam. Now, I'm not sure if the picture that you're looking at is the actual cave. In fact, it's probably not. But it would have been a cave very similar to this, because in the land of, or the region of Adullam, there were a lot of caves that David could go to hide. And so he went there to hide. Saul would have been looking for him, and it would have been more difficult when there were so many caves to look through. There were people who were able to find David, his brothers, and his father and his mother, the rest of his family. Everybody who is in distress, the Bible says, everybody who is in debt, anybody who had any trouble, they would all be able to find David. And there came to a point in time where they were hiding out in this cave, in the caves like this, where about 400 men had joined David. Would have been exciting times. I'm not sure I would like to live in a cave for a period of time. David then went, he was in this area of this is where Israel controlled, where it's orange in color. David then recognized that his family was not safe. So he took his parents to the land of Moab. Now, in Moab, you might remember David, his grandmother, Ruth, was from the land of Moab. And so he had connections there. And so he went to the king of Moab and said, "Will you please look after my father Jesse and my mother and make sure that they are safe from King Saul?" And so they went to Moab and then went back into Israel, which is in the orange area. You'll see Bethlehem is the area where David was born and where he grew up. Adullam is right here. These are the caves that David was hiding in. And you'll see Jerusalem was controlled by the Canaanites. It's in pink. And Jerusalem at this time, during the time of King Saul, was controlled by the Canaanites. Saul had his capital city in the area, or in a city called Geba. And Geba is highlighted. It's underlined in its larger letters. And this was the capital city of King Saul at this particular time. Geography is so exciting and it's so important, especially in these chapters of the Bible that we're studying this morning. So David went back from Moab after taking his father and his mother to safety. And then we pick up our reading in 1 Samuel 23, where we find out that Philistines are fighting against a city called Keilah. Now, in Keilah, the Philistines were coming in from Philistia. And so just over here, they were crossing into the border and they were starting to steal the grain that had been harvested by the people in and around Keilah. And so David asked the Lord, "Should I go up and protect the city of Keilah?" And the Lord said, "Yes." And so David then saved the people, the inhabitants of Keilah. Well, salvation like that, where David saved a whole city with his 400 men, the news went back up to Geba, where King Saul was. And Saul quickly heard about it, and he mustered the entire army of Israel. He called up all the men that he could find in this whole area, and he went down to find David in Keilah. So David asked the Lord, "Will Saul find me in Keilah?" And the Lord said, "Yes, Saul will find you." "Well, will the people of Keilah protect me, or will they surrender me in order to save their city?" And God said, "No, they won't protect you to save their city. They will turn you over to King Saul." So by this time, David had about 600 men who were with him. And David then moved to the wilderness of Ziph. So he continued to move south to this area right here. Now, the wilderness of Ziph, a lot of this area was wilderness at the time, but Ziph was a real wilderness. So we have Adullam where he was hiding out in a cave. We have Keilah where he's saved, and he moves down to Ziph. And the wilderness of Ziph, he goes to a specific location called Horish. Now, Jonathan was able to find David when he was in Horish. And Jonathan, when he found David, he said, "Do not fear the hand of my father. As much as he wants you dead, he knows that you will be the king. He knows that I will be sitting right beside you and supporting you as king." Well, the Ziphites heard that David was in their territory, and they reported back up to Saul, who was in the north. And Saul came down, and he was looking for David. David continued hiding in the wilderness of Ziph at Horish. Now, the wilderness of Ziph is a wild and it's a broad and it's a big area. And so there are different types of geography. The way geography is how the land is laid out. And so we have some areas known like the desert of Ziph, and a desert area is a place where there's no water or small amounts of rainfall. Or there's some areas where the rainfall happens on a seasonal basis, and so sometimes it just happens in the springtime. And then there are other areas where it does get a fair amount of rainfall, or it happens in this picture could have been in the springtime. So this is what the type of geography of where David was hiding out from Saul. And you can see there's not too many people around to report him, but he's traveling with 600 men. It's kind of hard to travel with 600 men. And yes, there would have been some women with him too, maybe even 1,000 people. So if 1,000 people move into your neighborhood, chances are you're going to know about it. So he's hiding out in the wilderness of Ziph at Horish. And Saul comes in to the wilderness. And as he's coming in, he's in hot pursuit. He wants his man, and he's searching for that man David. And Saul is roaming around, and David decided to hide out. Now, I don't know if it was a specific hideout like this. This looks like it has concrete, and they didn't have concrete back in that time, but there was some special hideouts in the region around the mountainous of Maon. And and so as David is hiding out in this area, the Bible says that Saul was on one side of a mountain and David was on the other side of a mountain. So let's say that Saul is over here and he's coming around, and he's perhaps, if he gets over to this side, David's over here. And it's almost like, have you ever washed your dad's car in the summer, and your dad is on the other side of the car, and he takes the hose and he sprays it over top of the car, and you have the sponge in your hand and you start running around the car, and so you and your dad try to just keep the car in between you. So this is exactly what it would have been like. It would have been really exciting times, and this massive mountain, you can't go over it, you got to go around it. And David was on one side and Saul was closing in on David. Saul was about to be was about to find David. And David didn't know that Saul was right behind him. Would have been tense times if they had only known. But just about the time when David is going to be captured, Saul has a messenger come in. Maybe the messenger came in from a distant land or from the north, and the messenger came up and said, "The Philistines are raiding our land." This happens so frequently in the Bible, where just at the right time, God sends in some enemy that are used for God's purposes. And this purpose was to save David. David then is freed. And so he called this area the Rock of Escape. That was a close one. If we were watching this in a movie, there would be some tense music, and the men would be riding in on their horses, and it would have been a very tense moment. Then we move on to chapter 24 in First Samuel. And in this chapter, David hides out in what is known as the wilderness of Engedi. Now, the wilderness of Engedi is right on the coast of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is a very salty area, and it wouldn't be one that I would want to hang out for too long. It was dry, and the water in the Dead Sea, you couldn't drink it at all. The Dead Sea right here. So, right on the coast. And he was hiding out in these kinds of caves. And as he was hiding out, Saul again caught news that David's near the coast of the Dead Sea. And Saul moves in with his army. And he he's trying to find David, and David finds one of these caves, a really big one, and he hides all his men deep, deep, deep inside the cave, and they're all being quiet when they realize Saul's coming into the cave. And one of the men said to David, "This is the opportunity that we've been waiting for. This is the time where God is going to allow you to kill King Saul, and then you can be the king just as God promised." David did not permit his men to attack Saul. You see, Saul came in to the cave so that he could be away from his soldiers because he needed to do something in private. He needed to go to the bathroom. And so, as he was going to the bathroom, David snuck up with his knife as Saul had taken off his royal robes. David cut a corner off the royal robe, and he snuck back in to the back of the cave. Saul finishes his business, cleans himself up, puts his robe back on, and walks down into the valley below. The area, the cave, is known as Wild Goats Rock Cave, it says in the Bible. Wild goats, here's wild goats climbing over the rocks. And Saul leaves his cave where he finished his business, and he goes down into the valley. And then David comes to the mouth of the cave, and he begins speaking, and he says, "King Saul, King Saul, why do you listen to the words of the men who say David seeks your harm?" And then he holds up a piece of the cloth, of the fabric where he had cut them off. And he says to Saul, "Today I didn't listen to my men who said I should put you to death. Here is proof that you were right in my hands." When David finished speaking, Saul was feeling so remorseful. He said, "David," from down in the valley, "you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I repaid you evil." And Saul continued, and he said, "Now I know you will become king. But when you become king, promise me, swear to me that you will not cut off all of my family or destroy my name from Israel." And David said, "I promise." David was faithful to God in obeying God's commands. God would raise him up to be king in his timing. For David to murder or to um, seek the throne, even though God had promised it in a way that is sinful, was not the way that God had intended. And so Saul went back to his home in Geba, and David, then recognizing Saul's not a man who could be trusted, he went on to another stronghold to be safe. So that is a whole story of David playing a game called cat and mouse with King Saul. You see, David was the little tiny mouse, and Saul was the big cat searching for that little mouse. And they were traveling all the way through a whole pile of different regions throughout this whole area. We have the Engedi, we have Moan, we have Keilah, Adullam. So that's a lot of land that's been traveled in today's lesson. The Bible tells us all these specific locations, and it's wonderful to go back and observe where these things took place because that gives us a whole background behind the story. So as you're in school and you're looking at going through your social studies lessons and you're learning about how to read a map and how to look at pictures to find out what an area is like, those skills are very important even when reading the Bible. And they're really exciting when you begin to understand how God moves and uses geography to help accomplish his plans. God is completely sovereign. He is in full control of all that's happening in our world. He was in full control of what David was doing, and he made sure that David was kept safe because that was his will for his life. Well, there's our lesson for today. Have a great week.